Welcome back to Season 1, Episode 5 of the Living for Today podcast, where we will explore the boundaries between reality and spirituality. I'll be your host, Ryan Kurczak. In today's episode, I'm speaking with Vincent DiPaola, a clinical Ayurvedic practitioner and fellow yogi, about how living through death can transform our spirit. Both Vincent and I have lost probably the most significant people that we've known to date in our lives in these past few years. And it's my hope through this discussion that we're able to find some ways of healing as we move through this loss and grief. So welcome, Vincent, to this podcast. I'm glad that you were able to tune in today and talk to myself and our audience. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Ryan. I really appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, we've known each other for at least a few years now, right? Because, I met you through studying astrology, if I remember correctly.
Correct. Yeah, it's 5 years now, over 5 years.
Yeah. And the reason, as you know, because we talked about this earlier, why I wanted to speak with you on this podcast is because you also have had, experiences of losing very important people in your life. And one of the things that we had discussed, which we'll get into, is the idea of how to move through grief, how to understand loss, how to relate that to having a healthy appreciation for life. And one of the strengths that you have is that you come from an Ayurvedic background, which might be a little different than what a lot of people know about or are used to. So we'll get into some of these topics that we discussed, but if you wouldn't mind, could you tell people where are you coming from? When we talk about having an Ayurvedic point of view, an Ayurvedic background, what does that mean? What are you up to? What are you about?
It's really a good question. Well, I guess we could start with, as you and I had discussed earlier, my time in India, as a sannyasi, as a monk, a yogic monk. I came across Ayurveda and began to understand it in the context of its being the oldest healing system known to man.
Right.
It's a very ancient healing system. And the word Ayurveda, as with all Sanskrit words, carries really the most focused concept of what the science is about, in that Ayur means life, and Veda, like all the Vedas we read, means knowledge or study. So it's the study of life. And in that one concept, I think it explains itself very fully in that the ancient rishis had nothing but observation at their disposal. So they put together all of these wonderful Vedic sciences like Jyotish and like Yoga and like Ayurveda, which is the healing arm of those three sisters.
Right.
Yoga being one sister, Jyotish being another sister, and Ayurveda being the third sister. And Ayurveda, yoga keeps you in balance and keeps you healthy. When you go out of balance, it's Ayurveda that comes in and fixes it. That's really the role it plays. So as the study of life, as the knowledge of life, it brings in an understanding of nature, what's natural. And right. So it's a living medicine, unlike, and all the ancient systems were the same as this. Even Chinese medicine is very much the same, traditional Chinese medicine. It's a living medicine. It's a living understanding of what we're going through in our present environment and how the effects of cycles produce different imbalances or balances, depending on how we handle it in our body.
Right.
So it's again, unlike maybe the Western approach to medicine, which is certainly an outstanding asset to have and very much in need for a lot of things that are going on today, but they tend more to treat a disease or a specific ailment. And in that way, it isolates it a bit. Whereas Ayurveda, or as I said, any of the traditional sciences, they take a holistic approach in that it understands what cycle of life we're in. And by cycles, I mean, really, Ayurveda is, like Jyotish, also very tied into the understanding of time. And you can't talk about Ayurveda without talking about time, because all life is cyclical. The seasons are one example of cyclical life. Even life itself starts out in one cycle and goes through the three basic doshas, the Kapha, Pitta, and Vata dosha. And I can explain those more if you'd like, but just to say that the first part of life, from birth through puberty, is the Kapha part of life. It's the beginning, it's the preparation for life.
Mm-hmm.
And once puberty starts and goes to about the age of 50 is when the Pitta period of or cycle of life comes in, where you're really outputting a great deal of energy and trying to make a living and get your life going and learning and understanding and producing income, raising families. It's all very hectic. And that's
Right.
the part of life. And then at the age of 50, right about where menopause, and for the male menopause, as I call it, comes through, then you enter the Vata time of life. So Pitta's activity, Vata is where that activity starts to become reflective, and it's more the time of life where you're in India. They would turn to spirituality at that time of life. Here in the States, we turn and start to think of retirement and those sort of things. So Kapha, being the beginning, is very lush and it's mucus, right? It's very soothing, and young people are full of energy and liquids. And then Pitta's the fire time where you're putting out a lot of energy. And then Vata comes in, and Vata starts to dry and diminishes the life part in preparation for your moving on.
Right.
Next stage of life.
Right. And that's, that whole idea, this leads into why I wanted to talk to you. Again, as we've discussed, there are these cycles that happen, and being someone who's been involved in Ayurveda and has taught at an Ayurvedic program, I teach the Jyotish, or the astrology portion of that, in Asheville. What I've noticed over the years, and I suffered from this myself, was this idea that there is this kind of cycle, which is, as you described, early childhood, then adulthood, and then moving into one's authority or elder years. And it's always treated as though it is something that runs on this like lengthy cycle, upwards of 100 years or so. And these cycles happen throughout all of nature. There's life, there is the activity, there is death. And what I really wanted to touch upon, to help people see that, or try to explore, how is it that life and death are interrelated in a healthy way? And again, my impetus was coming from losing Melissa at the age of 42, when we thought we had another 40 years to go. But she had a very profound healing process through that. And when I talk to people who are interested in Ayurveda and alternative medicine, there's always this idea that an individual might have failed, or an individual maybe didn't do something right if a disease does come about before they get into their Vata time period, or beyond 50, and so on. So, for you, who's had a lot of life experience, and I'm not going to throw out your age, but you've been around a few more decades than I have. And the reason I like to specify that, because I did that in an earlier podcast with the minister Jim Norton, is because in my mind, people who've lived quite a long time, longer than me, and so on, they've probably got some experience. They've seen death, they've seen life, they've seen birth, they've seen activity. So there's a bit of a better context to it all. And so for you, someone who's lived a very rich life and is still doing so, and has been involved in Ayurveda and healthcare, and has also lost many people in life, how do we tie all this together such that we can see life as this dance between birth and death, and even see death that as a transition into something greater? How does Ayurveda approach that?
Oh, wow, that's really a profound question. And thank you very much for giving me the chance to address it. I first want to say, and I hope I say this in the best way possible, that anyone who conceives of death as being at fault because of something that someone had done wrong is really incorrect about that. In yoga, we know, in Tantra, the yoga that I study is Tantra, and that's what I was doing in India, Tantra yoga. We understand that everyone has their time of death has been destined before we came here. They count life in yoga as number of breaths you're allowed in this lifetime to accomplish what you have to accomplish. So someone dying younger or is no way a mistake.
Right.
Part of their journey. Yes. So to get to your question about how Ayurveda views death, we go back to time, and I guess time has been a fascination of mine forever. I both know that we're musicians, so in music, time is everything.
Right.
Time is at the essence. And so as a young drummer, 12 years old, 13 years old, time began to mean a great deal to me. And then coming to yoga and to Ayurveda, this understanding of the cycles of life that you and I have just covered a bit really came to the forefront. So just as in the time of day, because everything in nature has a logic, and that logic carries across through all of nature. So we can look at one day and understand an entire life. In one day, you have the cycles of, again, kapha is always the beginning. So the very early hours of the morning. So, so Caesar built a clock. They told me in school, I don't believe it, but it was there before. But Caesar put his hours of the day. But prior to that, at the time Ayurveda was founded, the great rishis of old looked at time as in relationship to the movement of the earth.
Right.
Watch the sun and the moon go across the planets. So the day is divided between morning and night. There are 3 periods, again, kapha, pitta, and then vata in the morning. And so the first third from when the sun in relation to the earth starts its journey back up, that first third of that journey is the kapha time of day. So you're preparing yourself, you're resting, you're still asleep. Maybe 2 in the morning, we're talking about that, something like that happening. If you want a clock reference, but really it's totally dependent on location of the earth and what's going on physically. That first third is the kapha time where you're preparing for your day. And then the second third is the pitta time that goes where you're actually producing and putting out a lot of energy and a lot of fire. And that's the time that food comes in. And then you enter that kapha, the last third of the 12-hour cycle of that day. We'll call it 12 hours. Cycle of that day, which is the vata time. And that becomes night, and you're preparing for night. And then the nighttime starts. And that's also divided into the same 3/3, kapha, pitta, vata.
Right.
In that period, you inevitably, your body starts to shut down. In fact, physiologically, your digestive system and your agni, your fire, that you're assimilating not only food, but you're assimilating through light coming in, what you're doing and what you're processing as experience in the course of the day comes into you. And then the kapha time comes, and that last third of the day, you should have had all of your meals, all of your food in that daytime. At night, because that's the time that your metabolism is high. When night cut comes in, that second 12 hours, your body turns over to the immune system. It hands itself over to cleaning itself out, to the lymphatic system taking over. So, and slowly you sleep. And when you go to sleep, it's like you drift. We'll talk a lot about consciousness, I think, over the next hour, but your consciousness drifts into another state of consciousness. And in that state of consciousness, it is, in a sense, the death of the day. Right. The death of your day. So it's a natural going away. It's a natural sleeping. And no one really knows, or can express it anyway, that state of mind that happens in the night. But all we do know and hope for is that the kapha of the day will start and you'll prepare and get up again the next day. So
Right.
the cycle of life is exactly the same.
Right.
We're in our daytime now, and when it's time to go to sleep for us, when death comes, it's identical. You leave this conditioned mind, your conditioned consciousness, and you drift off into a state of death. And again, no one can emphatically tell you what that's like because it can't be experienced by the conditioned mind that we use in this single lifetime.
Right.
To it, and that mind is built to fulfill that condition, the completion of your karma, the samskara, right? The karma is the actions and the reactions, and the samskara is the reactions of those actions. So those samskara have to be taken care of in this lifetime. Which of those karmas have ripened? So in that nighttime now, we're resting, and the immune system of whatever death is, whatever pitta parts, kapha, pitta, vata parts are going to happen, they happen until you come back into the next lifetime. So
Right.
continuous flow. And a lot of people, or a lot of thought, let's say a lot of thought, try to break that into definite sections. And that's not the way it is. I was thinking about how to explain this to you. And as a musician, I think I found a way.
Okay, good. Let's hear it.
Think of a fretless guitar.
Yes.
Because you play guitar. Beautiful.
Right.
And the fretless guitar has its string tensioned across that string. If you would think of a guitar normally, you would think of it in frets, the first fret, the second fret. That is what it's like to try to section these thoughts off of the particular stages of life or death or day or night. But rather, if you take the frets away, then that string can be a continuous flow, right? The sound on that string, if you press your finger down and slide, it can be a continuous flow without the hard break between one fret and another fret, or one tone and another tone. So too is consciousness. Consciousness, we all possess all consciousness. So in going from life to death, it's like that same string. It's seamless. You don't really know exactly where you are without the frets, but you harmonize.
Right.
Right?
Yeah, yeah.
You harmonize with that state you're in presently. There you are, perfectly done. So no one can pick out a note in there, yet all notes between the start and the finish are there.
Right. So just because I happen to have an instrument here with me, you're saying instead of going, it's more like it's more like a slide.
Exactly.
Right.
And I always credit you, even in my astrology classes, with you, the way you can bring it down like you just did to a very unique, solid way of understanding it. But yes, it's like that. Because consciousness just flows. It just flows. And you mentioned to me earlier you started your day in meditation, as I do each morning. So that segues naturally. You try to bring that forward and flow through the day. You don't leave your meditation behind and say, okay, that stopped, and now I'm going forward to breakfast.
Right.
You know what I mean? Yeah. I try to flow through the day. I try to meditate a couple of times a day to get from one point to another point, and then pick it up again and go on and let that flow.
Right.
I don't know if I got off track there and I missed.
No, I mean, that brings up a lot. I mean, that brings up a lot of things. And I know when we had initially started talking, one of the other things we mentioned talking about was, what I had heard and learned from like Peter Fenwick and the idea of dying well. So I want to get to that. But before we do, based on what you've just said, I just wanted to make that comment so I don't forget to go back to that. From what you have said, there's this idea of the cycle, and there's this idea of how life shifts and how life changes. And it's not just simply one point to the next. There is a flow to it. And Going back to the original idea, the reason I wanted to speak to this is because, again, when I talk to a lot of people who are interested in health and well-being and these sorts of things, there is this idea that if illness or disease or even death arises, that really something has gone wrong, or there is a problem. And when I teach, like, for example, astrology for Ayurveda and these sorts of things, most of the people are younger, they're in their early 20s, and I remember being that age, and there's almost this sense of, for example, Ayurveda can cure everything, or natural health things can cure everything, even things like, illness, disease, and death. And, as we've discussed, myself and even Melissa, we practiced Ayurveda. She was a vegetarian. She had regular treatments with Ayurveda, but yet still at a young age, she passed. And one of my healing teacher mentors one time told me, he said, look, if you really want to help someone, you have to not care one way or the other if they get well or if they get worse, or if they live or if they die. He said, because the moment you start getting caught up in this definition of well-being and this definition of what is good and what is not, you start to develop attachments, and then maybe part of their path is to help them pass well, or to simply help them manage an illness, because that is part of an experience they need to have. And this again opens up into a much broader thing, because, for example, on one hand, as Melissa was not doing so well and she was eventually passing, there was a great sense of loss and a great sense of grief, mind-boggling so much so, but there was so much healing going on for her. Like the way that she treated her relationships, she cleared up all kinds of difficult baggage with just friends and family. She let go of a lot of attachments to things that were holding her back. She expressed things that were important to her that she did not feel she was able to. So even though the physical body was going through a difficult thing, because of that illness, because of that difficulty, it gave an opportunity for healing on a more profound level. So basically, what I would like to hear from you, I know I keep throwing out these like multiple point questions at you, but what I would like to see what your thoughts are number one, since you've probably seen a lot of younger individuals also learning Ayurveda, how would you explain to them that while well-being and health is important, that also disease and illness and even death have an important role? And let's just stop there, because then we can take it more into the Peter Fenwick work of dying well and how a person can actually be fully healed in the most important way, even though their body may expire. And again, as I used in a previous podcast, C.S. Lewis, he had a wonderful term. He called it, when someone becomes unbodied, when they leave the body. But to back up, when you're thinking about communicating with people who are full of idealism, are full of this whole idea that, health and well-being is available to everybody at every point in time, and that things like natural medicine, Ayurveda can always make that happen. How do you think about that? How do you approach that? How would you express just thoughts around that?
Oh,
the question makes sense, right?
Oh, it makes perfect sense. It makes perfect sense. I'm trying to frame it before I explain it.
Okay.
And I'd like to frame it, I think, again, in the concept of Ayurveda, understanding a holistic approach, an entire approach. So to see illness as anything